Wow, important. All right, thank you all for coming out today for part two of the Student Health Surveys webinar series that we're doing with Jen. Really looking forward to building this into our curriculum of materials with our schools that we work with throughout the year. For those of you that caught last session, which was 2 weeks ago, we were really diving into, what's the purpose of a student health survey? What are we using this for? What's the point? How do we really justify what we do to say admin or other people on campus? So lots of really good information in that previous recording that is up on our website for those. If you ever need to go back, check it out, and we'll see slideshows and stuff once we're done with everything when it comes to that. For today, we're going to focus on now the back half of those things. So what do we do with the data? I think that's something I hear a lot from people is they say, well, we did a survey, we sent the report off, or we did biannual review, but it doesn't leave your office. And so now we're going to talk about, how to take that out of just being a paper report, bringing it to life and using that for prevention. So we're going to pass it over to Jen here. She's going to give her a brief introduction and we'll get going. And if you've got questions, we'll have time to talk about them, unmute, and go from there. So I will hand it off to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Annabelle, and thanks for the invitation today. Thanks for the folks who are here at the end of May in higher education. We graduated our students almost 2 weeks ago now, but I don't know about you all. Friday is the end of my fiscal year, so it's a really exciting time to be a budget manager. My name is Jen Jacobson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of health and wellness here at Macalester College, small residential college in St. Paul, Minnesota. But also, I came up through public health training, health promotion, and have had a lot of interest in survey work and survey data, and have been fortunate enough to be the PI of various surveys for about 20 years now. About me, I know some of you were here last time, but just briefly, fun fact, I am originally from Illinois. I'm from the northwest suburbs of Chicago. But I think fondly of Illinois, and it was really great to get to visit the state capital of Springfield for your conference 2 years ago now. I've worked about 30 years in higher education, primarily at small liberal arts colleges, but I have done some graduate teaching through some of my graduate programs at larger state universities. My first career was as a Division III men's and women's track and field coach, and what is relevant about that is track and field is a measurable sport, and so I've always been into measurement and thinking about how we can think about things quantitatively. Leading campus surveys, Survey of Student Athlete Norms by Perkins and Craig, the ACHA, NCHA, the National College Health Assessment, Healthy Mind Survey. I have not worked professionally in Illinois, so I haven't done I want to call it like the IACUB, but that's not quite right. But Annabelle can correct me here.
Yeah, the Ike sub.
Ike sub. That's right. The
I
Ike
think about
sub.
it like Ike's in Charleston, like an Ike sub sandwich.
Oh, I love it.
Yep.
And then, right, as much as I love the quantitative data, I also love the institutional research office. Today, I'm going to show you how we break out some of our data by demographics. And I just want to say, I'm not an expert in doing software management and statistical analysis. You may or may not be an expert, but you don't have to go it alone. There's partners that can help you if you're wanting to parse your raw data, and it could be your institutional research office. I've also been known to befriend psychology professors. I've also been known to find, here at Macalester, we have data science as one of our majors, and I've also been known to befriend some of those students and have this be some of their student work hours. What better job than to get to learn about your own population? But yes, so I showed this last time, but there are days on our campus now that I have this data in hand. It feels like Christmas morning to me, like the day we get the email that say the National College Health Association data is available. I get really excited about it, and not everyone else does, but part of my work is figuring out relevant ways to get other people excited about it too. I'm curious, right? So, Sean, I recognize you from part one. I don't remember if Vanessa was at part one. Matt, we had you for part of part one. Is that right?
Yep.
All right. I'm curious if any of you play a role in drafting your Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act biennial review. Yeah, I see sad nodding. So right, I find our survey data really helpful in part of what we do for our Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act biennial review, and I'll touch on that today because it's 2026, which means we're in a biennial review year. I'm still in my optimistic phase that our Director of Health Promotion and I will get it done this summer instead of just under the wire in December like we've done with our last two biennial reviews, but we'll see what happens. All right. And so we've already asked these questions last week about what student surveys you do and how familiar you are. So what we said we do in this part is talk about key stakeholders within your prevention program and process to review the data with. Develop some key points for using existing data to advocate for prevention funding programming, incorporate into your Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act biennial review. Devise ways to share data with key audiences using a bite, snack, and meal approach. So thinking about identifying key stakeholders to share with, I'm curious, right, from Sean and Matt and Vanessa, if Vanessa's with us here synchronously, when you get your survey results, who are you excited about sharing them with?
I know that on our end, any surveys that we have typically done, um, we will at worst present it to our student affairs leadership team. Now, there have been other ones like the very big ACHA one. They want us to do that for leadership and dean's cabinet and board of trustees and like 5 million other places. But at minimum, that's where we share
hmm
it.
That's great that they're so interested in you sharing it with different audiences. Remind me where you're working, Matt.
Eastern,
Oh,
Eastern
sure,
Illinois.
sure.
We're all
I've run the state track meet there twice. 100 years ago now. How about you, Sean?
I guess I don't have that kind of excited audience for this information. It's really just the vice president of student affairs
hmm
and the counseling staff are the people primarily interested. The other student affairs staff are like, okay, that's interesting, and we'll occasionally talk among that leadership about different things to do, but for the most part, unfortunately, it's a document that needs to be, it's results that we need and a document we need to produce and that kind of thing, but there's really no global interest or buy-in for it.
hmm I love though that you named your counseling team. I think sometimes we assume that our colleagues in college health, whether it be counseling or medical or that, kind of just know this stuff. And I have often found when I do pub quiz type work that our college health team is no more in tune with the actual norms and what students report than other folks on campus. So I love that you're thinking about your counseling team as a primary audience. Because sometimes we just get comfortable and assume they know, and they may not know. Um, one of the things I really like about the Ike sub is it's newer in the NCHA that they ask about some data about are you thinking about leaving, but I like the Ike sub does that too because it lets us get to more tables because most people on your campus are interested in thinking upstream about for our students who are thinking about leaving, what are those reasons? And then we've tried to use that to tie that to some of our work. Thinking about right, we know maybe if we're working somewhere in student affairs and college health, there's less we can do about the number one reason why people I think about leaving is they don't offer my major here. But those things that are related to I've had a negative experience, I don't feel like I belong, ongoing physical or mental health challenges, those are things we can do. Um, I try whenever I can, right? Like if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. Anything I can tie back to substance use, I try to do because that makes the case for why our work is important and we should be at more tables. I think Matt needs to lead a webinar about how he gets to present to all these different audiences.
I don't know about that. That's just more of kind of a voluntold type deal.
Hmm.
You know.
Yes, but if they didn't think it was valuable, they wouldn't ask you back.
It's true.
So Eric just bringing stuff up, and then the VP of Student Affairs goes, "Oh, well, you need to have them report out on that." And then
Oh, I love that. And once you like are the guy with the bow tie, you have some kind of authority, right?
something like that.
I always think about some of our audiences to bring back small pieces are the folks we identified 2 weeks ago who might have helped us encourage student participation. So we already named, right, our college health folks. But right, whoever responsible, but of course it might be you for your drug-free schools and communities biennial review is usually pretty invested in having some of this data identity-based student programs and support. So if you're robust enough that you can break down your data in any way by identity, athletics, and I'll show you an example of how we've done some work with athletics. If you have Greek life, disability resources, residential life orientation. Macalester, we're only 56% residential, and so that actually becomes a pretty easy two buckets to make of residential students and non-residential students. You don't need a very large N to make that relevant. And our residential life is really interested in what are some of the key differences between students who live on campus and off campus. Our communications, alumni relations, parent-family programming, transfer students, and our faculty. So I just wanted to show you, so again, I don't do the statistical breakdown. That's our international or our institutional research office. But one of the ways our Center for Disability Resources here at MAC ended up being a great partner in promoting the survey. And I promised them if they help promote the survey and we got enough participation, then I would come back to them with some breakout data about students who self-reported disability and students who don't report a disability, where there's some similarities and differences with our general college population. We didn't do it for every single item. This is from our NCHA, but we did it with some key items. And thinking about, right, that we do see statistically significant differences in our students with self-reported disabilities in terms of less likely to say their health is very good or excellent or to feel like they belong. But similar, I mean, not statistically significant, different rates of saying they feel like students' health and well-being is a priority here or that we look out for each other. And slightly less likely statistically to say that we encourage free and open discussions about student health and well-being. Center for Disability Resources was really glad to have this information because this is going to seed some conversations and they have, right? So we can think mixed methods, taking these quantitative pieces and for them to have some discussion on what does this mean for them or how can they talk to some of their student leaders about how to address these things or where these gaps are. But also then I'm hopeful that investment in turn means that they will again be good partners in helping drive student participation in the survey. Our NCHA comes around again this next spring. Disaggregated data. So we disaggregate by varsity student athletes and other students because at a small college, our varsity student athletes is 28% of our population. But what I did was for our student athlete mentors, and you could do this, every NCAA school has a student athlete advisory committee. Is we made this, right? Athletics, you make everything a competition. I made this a competition where they had to decide of the two groups who is more likely to, right? Varsity student athletes or other students. So who's more likely to say their health is very good or excellent? Who's more likely to agree or strongly agree that a student's health and well-being is a priority? Who scores higher on the Diener flourishing scale? Spoiler alert, these first three, all student athletes are more likely to say it than other folks. They score higher on the resilience scale. They score lower on the Kessler distress scale. But this is what was fascinating. Our varsity student athletes score statistically significantly higher on the UCLA loneliness score. That was counterintuitive to me. I know it's counterintuitive to Sean too. But what was great about doing this in a session with student athlete leaders I could ask them why, because I said I was surprised, and they thought for a second and they said, we are not, because of the way our schedules work. The only people we tend to see socially are our teammates, and that's really limiting. And if you don't get along with some of your teammates, or if your teammates, they're good teammates, but they're not your besties, they're not your friends, and some of those barriers. And so that led to some really interesting conversation that also feeds into residential life. Should our student athletes coming in as a first year be able to request living with someone else on their team, or as we're thinking about long-term protective factors about loneliness, should they not be able to do that? So they're meeting at least one other person. I learned at my last institution, there was this sense that student athletes were isolating themselves. And one of the captains of our women's soccer team said, when we come for preseason and it overlaps with orientation, we're not allowed to have practice during the key orientation activities. But everything that is fun and optional that's happening at orientation, we're either at practice or recovering because we're practicing at 6 in the morning, and then orientation ends, classes start, and all the other first years have made friends. And I didn't get to make friends with anyone who wasn't on the soccer team. Or I had a softball player tell me, in our lab courses, once people know I'm a student athlete, no one wants to be my lab partner because they think that I'm going to cut out early from lab to make it to practice. So the only other people who are my lab partners are other student athletes, and it's a missed opportunity to meet people. So I think that was interesting. Student athletes less likely to say anxiety, depression, sleep difficulty, stress have negatively impacted their academics. Um, but they are more likely to think that the average Macalester student prefers to be drunk when having sex with other people, which helps us then get an opportunity to dispel some social norms. The other way we think about how do we get this information back out to a population is if you have classes on your campus, whether it's health psychology or statistics, there is no subject that our students are more interested in than themselves, right? That's developmentally appropriate for 18 to 22-year-olds. So we think about how can we ethically share parts of our data set with some of those groups to use for their coursework, and great faculty partnerships in that way. With our health psychology course, we actually identify from our NCHA data some highlights, and we ask them to pick for their project to make a social media campaign. And we give them 10 options of which groups could choose 5. And this is the order of popularity, is they were really excited about HPV vaccination, and then weirdly sunscreen. We didn't predict that. Binge drinking, anxiety, and then driving under the influence of cannabis. What it did for us is then as their class project, they developed some social media content, which we had to do some editing for with our health communication background. But we learned which data engaged students. They were way more interested in sunscreen than driving under the influence of cannabis. But then they generated some things that were nice because, right, these look like students made them as opposed to looking like our team made them. That was really engaging and saved us some labor. We also think about it, right? You all are living in 2006 along with us, where not only is there a proliferation of health misinformation, there is health disinformation as well. And so we think about how we can use our survey data to help educate our students about ways people will bring statistics to them all the time. I always tell them, just like you shouldn't take candy from a stranger, don't take data from people who aren't citing their source. But every time I present our data in a snack or a meal size thing, I always want to show them who was it who took the survey, right? So they want to have a sense, is this representative of our campus student body? But also remember, we talked last time of our partnership with our international students and our varsity student athletes to say, hey, you're underrepresented in the survey. Now, when we show this data out, we can say, and hey, look, we have proportional representation from our international students because they really invested in taking the survey. And same thing with our student athletes, which we hope will seed interest in doing this next time. But they want to know, right, is this representative of our campus? It also lets us get help with interpretation when necessary. So this is from the Ike sub, right? And this is pretty early in the survey, asking some questions. And as much as I love quantitative data, we're all aware of the limitations of quantitative data. And I'll say I like these questions are more nuanced. The first question in the National College Health Assessment Survey, it says, I feel like I belong at my college or university. And Macalester students will come up to me when I'm sharing data out about that and say, well, Jen, like, what do you mean by belong? And I said, well, it doesn't matter what I mean or what I think it means. It's what you think it means when you take the survey. And so I look at some of these questions and I think about what an interesting opportunity for you to talk with your students about when you say, when the question is asked of you, what I feel I have a sense of belonging to your campus community. What does that mean to you? What would make you say yes? What would make you say no? If you've ever done Healthy Mind Survey, one of the things I really love about it is it says there's a question about, I feel part of the campus community at my college. And then there's a separate question that says, I feel part of one or more communities within my college. And actually, I care more about the second, that they feel that they have some communities, because not all of our students at Macalester are going to identify with a predominantly white institution. Not all of our students are going to align themselves with who they imagine to be the man institutionally, but they might have pockets of community, and that part's important. So I just always think it always gives us a launching point to have some discussion and learn from students, like I learned from our student athlete leaders about why they might feel lonelier. Read your data reports carefully. I'm going to show you two examples. And this first one, right, was our NCHA data. It was after they changed the data and how they reported the data in 2019. And it almost gave me a heart attack, right? Because I looked at it and I'm like, oh, prescription medications, like what you've used that wasn't prescribed to you in the past 3 months. And I was like 60.3%. But then the fine print is this was asked only of students who self-reported any non-medical use of prescriptions ever. And really, any lifetime use was 5.7%. So when this survey reporting out was only including students who self-reported using the last 3 months, that's fewer than 2% of our students. And then looking at the numbers, what a small percentage this was of our overall students. So just reading carefully, because, and I'll show you the Ike sub also, you're going to want to look at how the data is reported out, because you might also have the same heart attack. The very first time they started asking questions at NCHA about driving and cannabis and marijuana, I opened it up and I was like, 30% of our students are driving after using cannabis and marijuana. Like, that is surprising and shocking to me. But it only includes students who used cannabis in the last 30 days and who drove a car in the last 30 days, so that it ended up being fewer than 5% of all of our survey participants. So again, just reading closely, but also it means I never want to just hand over our survey data to someone else who's not familiar with the survey, because they won't know how to interpret it. I do think it's interesting. We have more students who self-report driving after within 6 hours of cannabis use than driving after having any alcohol. So it lets us know where maybe some of our health campaigns should be, but less than 5%, way less stressful than if it were 30% of all of our students. Here's where you might see it in the Ike sub is like when I was paging through the executive summary, right? My eyes are drawn to this beautiful graph. I'm not great at data visualization. This is such nice data visualization. And when I look at this, I was like, oh my gosh, like there's a lot of students who are using misusing prescription medications at least 1 to 6 times a year, but potentially 3 or more times a week for stimulants and amphetamines. But then, right, once I go back and look at the aggregate data, this is of the 42 students who self-reported using prescription drugs in the last 12 months, right? And we can see, right, it's fewer than 20% of students who self-report misusing any prescription drugs in the last 12 months. So just making sure both you are grounded in that when you are reading it, but also it could be so easy for the vice president of student affairs to ask to see that data report. And if they're not as familiar as you are with reading it, they might make some mistakes in interpretation of the report. Understanding the survey and its limitations. So, not to get too far in the weeds, but we saw our students have a lot of interest in HPV vaccinations, right? So students self-reporting getting the HPV vaccine. When we just started looking at our longitudinal data between 2019 and 2024, we're like, wow, we see a drop in students self-reporting getting the HPV vaccines. Maybe that's because after the whole rollout of COVID vaccines, there's more vaccine hesitancy. That could be part of the story. The other part of the story is knowing how they changed how they asked the question. So in 2019, they were still asking the question this way: have you received the following vaccinations, shots, or series of shots? This is part of a long list of questions where they're asking if you got your polio vaccine, if you got your measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. If I'm a student who's not used to thinking a lot about my own healthcare, I might just be checking down the list and say, my mom, because it's almost always their mom, took me to the pediatrician and we got all the vaccines, so I'm going to say yes. By 2024, they changed the question to be more specific to help people know what was being asked. They explained what the vaccine is. They gave some name brand answers. It talks about how it's a series of 2 or 3 shots. And we see our percentages drop. It could be because fewer students are pursuing the vaccination. Or it could be that the previous numbers were overcounting the number of students who got the HPV vaccine because students didn't understand the question. The question's more understandable now. So it was just to say, keep an eye on limitations of your survey. So learning outcome 2, developing some key points for using existing data to advocate. I'm just going to give a couple of examples, but before I jump into my examples, I'm curious, Sean or Matt, if you've had success or if there's a particular piece of one of the surveys that people respond to or that you feel is really useful for prioritizing programming.
I think whenever I look back at some of our surveys where we've done some substance use questioning, um, things really stand out for people when it comes to cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they gravitate to that, even though like the last one that I can think of that we did, cannabis was number 3.
Yes.
Tobacco was still 2, alcohol was still 1, but they were like, look at cannabis. And
Mm-hmm.
I agree to a certain extent. Yes, it was much larger than perhaps we would like it to be, but it was still number 3. And they wanted to point to the alcohol piece, and um they wanted to laugh that I had data that did show that, still a good chunk of students don't drink, and even our
Mm-hmm.
staff were like, that's not true, that's a joke. And I was like, no.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I was like, no, they're not drinking. And even if they are drinking, I've got the data that shows they're actually doing it really smartly. So
Mm-hmm.
honestly, even though that's our number 1 substance use, I'm actually quite pleased with that because either they're not using or they are reporting in general they're using smart.
Yeah. Man, I appreciate you saying that. Like I always, right? Like our fellow colleagues are one of our audiences who are just as susceptible to misperceived norms as anyone else, and they are actually in positions of power to reinforce misperceived norms. The other piece I think about too, right? And I just looked a colleague at a different institution posting that they were having a champagne toast during senior week, and I was like, oh gosh, like why not call it a bubbly toast and have champagne and an attractive non-alcoholic beverage offered equally alongside it? Because you and I both know we have a percentage of students who don't drink, but I also think about when we think about equity on our campuses and social justices and protected classes, A lot of the reasons why students choose not to drink relate to being part of a protected class because of their religion, their pregnancy status, their mental health status, any number of things. And I thought, why would we promote something that would make folks of protected classes feel excluded? I do always love when I ask students why they don't drink, and sometimes people say, I don't want to, I'm too busy, and I don't like the taste, because those are also okay reasons. But it is really interesting the pushback we get. And I agree with you. That people tend are gravitating towards wanting to think about cannabis because we've been talking about alcohol so long and we've been talking about tobacco so long. Now the vaping industry, a whole different thing. I don't know if you all saw the FDA just approved that that yes, there can be fruit flavored vapes marketed, right? That's not a win for public health. But to remind people that those other substances are still around and we're seeing actually a big jump in tobacco and nicotine products over the last 6 years. And to keep an eye on that as well. And I'll talk in a hot second too. Opioids are by far like the sexiest and most interesting things for people to talk about. And the usage of students on our campus is so comparatively low that we have student groups on campus who are wanting to do naloxone training, and that is great and that is important. And they will do a session that spends 45 minutes on naloxone training and 10 minutes on alcohol overdose training. When statistically speaking, on our campus, you are going to be much more likely to run into a student who's overdosed on alcohol who needs help than on an opioid. So.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually something that I've experienced here with the opioid training. You know, we have free naloxone all over
Mhm.
campus. We do offer the trainings. I think they are great. I get great feedback from it. But I will have occasionally some people ask me like, "Oh my gosh, do we have overdoses on our campus?" And I was like, "Well, technically, no." Um,
Mhm.
if there is, I don't have any data that shows it, and I don't know of anything. Now, yes, this does make them just better health citizens.
Yes.
Um,
We
you know,
talk
it,
about
it
it as being part of a good community member.
yeah, it makes them a better community member for the city of Charleston. And I do know that many of our students do come from areas
Mhm.
where they may know individuals and interact with friends, family who do have that. So it's a protective factor in that way. But everyone's really on board with that. And I don't ever have any data that shows them like this is a pressing need.
Hmm.
They wanted it to be as elevated as AEDs on our campus and have their own boxes. And some organization reached out to me. They were going to help me write grants. And I was like, cool, you can do that. The best I have for you is state data because if you're asking for institutional data, I have nothing because
Yes.
it's not really a thing.
And we run the risk of over norming opioid use if we elevate it above the more common substances that our students use.
Hmm.
Sean, is there anything in your data that jumps out to you that you've used to advocate?
Uh, Some of it's what Matt's already said in that, there's in terms of beliefs, students believe that people are drinking more than they really are. Um, what concerned us is it's not a huge number, but there's a small percentage of students who are, consuming such a high amount of alcohol that this, it's like we're concerned about their well-being,
Yes.
because their binge drinking habits are severe. And then the other thing, which is not really from this data, is just, in this area we're having communities banning kratom,
Yes.
is and we're not sure how much that's of an issue, but we know that certain stores are selling huge quantities of it, and so I guess part of my question, and this may be something for later, just um how that drug is addressed in some of these instruments and surveys. So
I haven't seen it addressed in instruments yet. The first I really learned in depth about it was I went to the Meeting of the Minds over in St. Louis this April, and there was a session on kratom there, which was I was so glad I went because I've started to see billboards. Um, and Wisconsin puts up billboards on the border with Minnesota to say Minnesota bans everything, but we don't, and
Yeah.
come across the border, right? Yeah, I think that's one of the wild, wild west sort of things where it is marketed as sort of natural and herb-like, and it seems like there's some potentially really terrible outcomes, but I don't think we're asking about it yet. I am envious that the Ike sub asks about in what routes people are ingesting their cannabis. We use NCHA and NCHA doesn't ask that, and we would lean into some different kinds of education if we knew that more people were doing edibles versus smoking. So. But one of the distinctions I really like that you made, Sean, is we can look at number of students of drinking who are drinking, but also looking at the intensity of how much they are drinking, right? Because a student who's drinking a couple times a month, maybe they're having a beer, watching a game, worries us so much less than the student who's going out regularly and having 8 to 10 drinks. And those are different approaches of how we try to help those students. I love both of those examples. We've used some of this for advocacy. NCHA right now has the USDA food security measure, and I will say, when we first started having a food pantry on our campus, we had a lot of people say, "Why does McAllister have a food pantry? You're a private school. How do you have students?" And disbelief from our own campus that we had students who were food insecure. And it's funny, this question was asked for the first time in spring 2021, and that's the first time we had any data, and it surprised me how high it was. But I'm like, well, high to COVID, maybe families are losing jobs, those kinds of things. But it was even higher in spring 2024. So important for us for this narrative on campus, but also important for our person who leads the food pantry to have some of this data for the grant work that he does to help support some of the grants that support the food pantry, but important for development because um, food pantry and other things to support first generation and low income students is an easy place for alumni to give, even if they're mad at the institution. And this helps demonstrate need for that. So it helps them advocate. I try when I share this kind of data to show them the kinds of questions they are asked so that people have a sense of what it means and what students are answering. We also, this was athletics. The AD is a good colleague of mine, and he came to me and he said, Jen, faculty are coming to me and they say, student athletes, their mental health is so much worse than other students. What are you doing about it? Right? And so I said, well, let's figure out whether or not that's true. And so this was back when we had our Healthy Mind survey. You could do this with any number of surveys, but to look at, and you shared, I shared some of this before with the way we ask this of our student athletes to guess, but actually to say, well, here's where we don't see differences, and here's where actually our student athletes are reporting statistically significantly better mental health outcomes. Now, we don't know if people who are experiencing better mental health are more likely to have the bandwidth to participate in athletics, or if there's something about athletics that's reinforcing the positive mental health. But this really challenged the notion in a way that was grounded for our faculty who were pushing on this about was what they were saying documented to be the case. And the answer was really no. Not that we shouldn't still care about it, but the difference in I love this one. The confidence in finishing their degree no matter what, 96 point versus 81% is a huge difference, right? Um, but yeah, so that was some advocacy we did to help support our athletics program. So our harm reduction cabinet, so Matt, like you, super sexy on our campus. We're a small campus and our campus safety carries naloxone, and we have student EMTs who work Thursday through Sundays. They carry naloxone. We used to have naloxone that public safety had in every AED on campus. All of it expired before it was used. And public safety said this isn't a good use of our money. We'll just put it in the AEDs in our residence halls. We had a group of students who said, but no, we need it where all of our students can access it. And we said, okay, You can, we have a system where students can ask for free or no cost saver sex supplies to be anonymously delivered to their student mailboxes. We'll add naloxone and fentanyl test strips to that list. And the public health person in me also always adds drug disposal kits because, man, if you're testing something for fentanyl and it's positive, we want to make the safer choice the easy choice to have it right there. And they said, well, we need an option where it is available 24/7 to all students because you might not think 3 days ahead of time to request it to your mailbox. So we worked with students and discovered the one place on all of campus that all students had key card access 24/7 was the vestibule of our library. Libraries are always your best public health partners, so they let us put our harm reduction cabinet in there, which looks very anonymous on the outside because admissions tours stop in the vestibule, and we didn't want our tour guides to have to field a lot of questions. But we agreed on one place felt proportional, not having to try to advocate for everywhere on campus. So it's there, but it's alongside, right? Condoms and lube and Plan B and all of the things. Um, Part of our advocacy to our senior leadership when we did this, I wanted to make sure that they didn't think that our senior leadership wasn't taking away from our ask that we had an opioid problem on campus. And you'll see I included from the NCHA the risk assist because what I did want to plant a seed for was 25% of all of our students are at moderate risk in the cannabis risk assist. So while it's great we're doing this, we are working with a small number of students. But please, when we ask for your support for other types of work related to substance use, remember we're probably going to ask about cannabis. Fewer students use cannabis, but seem to be experiencing more unwanted outcomes from it. But the data really helped us with that because you can see, right? We didn't want to unintentionally over norm because a half a percentage of our students say that they've been using opioids in that way. Your Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act biennial review. We all remember the last time we got federal guidance on it was 2006. To Annabelle's point, now with the younger generation taking over, like maybe you were in kindergarten then. I just want to give my shout out to Eastern Illinois being the only place that offers us systemic support on how to write this in a way that is compliant. Because even though the federal government is no longer telling us and giving us guidance on how to do it, they're still willing to fine you for not doing it right. But just to remember, right, in the really nice outline of what to include in it, they put right here, right, of this is the kind of survey data you might include. And that is really helpful for us to have on hand, whether it's the ICSUB, whether it's the NCHA, whether it's core survey data or whatever you have. This is part of, if we don't have it, it's really harder to do our biennial review. Keys for social norming. So one of the things I really love about the ICSUB is it has questions like this. I pulled alcohol for this example, but they also have it around cannabis and nicotine about what motivates you to drink less. When I was at Grinnell and we used to do the student athlete social norm survey, I could put in custom questions, and I used to put in a custom question about if you choose not to use, now we would say cannabis, why did you choose not to use cannabis? And then actually hired one of our student athletes who had a really, his branding of things he did on campus were really unique to him. So this was so clear that this was his and not just mine. Because, right, part of our work is reinforcing the choices of our students who choose not to use or to use less, right? And so we can see, maybe not surprising at Grinnell, academics and athletics both probably equally high at about 80%. Also interesting to me that last was their coaches' expectations around 52%. And then I smacked my own forehead and said, Jen, that's because you've never done a workshop with the coaches about how cannabis affects athletic performance and academic performance. That's why coaches haven't messaged on it yet. But I think in the ICSUB, you really have some really rich data that for social norms of, the top 4 reasons why students on our campus say they are motivated to not drink or drink less is for these things that will help other students see themselves in that group who's choosing not to use on a given night or at all. Also, just that reminder, always teaching health literacy. You'll see at the bottom of the poster, our student included, who did the research and where it came from, what the size of the N was, and who to contact for more information. And that's in an effort, right? A lot of times with our social norms data, people's first instinct, like Matt said, like is to push back against the data and say it must not be true. And when you're like, well, this was out of 95% of our student athletes. You took the survey. So, and again, things let us say things right. And again, pulled this right out of the Ike sub. The ways that you can say the majority of students on our campus have not misused prescription drugs in the last 12 months. And again, I touched on this last time, so I saved this for last because don't need to go as far in depth. But thinking about, right, I used to think the only way for me to share the survey data is to have a whole hour with people. And it really freed me up when Illinois Department of Health helped me think about bite, snack, and meal approaches. When I think about this, right, and again, I showed last time, my favorite way to do it is with the wheel of norms, and that is just a slight bite. But to Matt's point, I've worked more places. When in January, our student affairs retreat was looking for some fun tabling in the first get to know you hour when we were having coffee and pastries, I said, let us come with the wheel of norms because we knew our colleagues were in just as much need of learning about some of our survey data, but also again to plant the seed to say, hey, in less than a year, we're going to be doing this survey again. We're going to ask you for help. Now you know some things about it. Again, the pub quizzes I like doing in any space I am because I like people to debate collaboratively about why they think answers are the way they are and an opportunity in the debrief to help correct them. I always, I think about when I added custom questions. In my last institution in our campus-wide learning outcomes, there was nothing included about athletics. So with our social norm survey, I put 6 questions mapped on the college-wide learning outcomes right onto the survey. And then I made a set of 2-foot by 3-foot posters, and I would post it every time our senior leadership team met in our building. I would post these in the hallway to remind them, right, that athletics is doing these things, even if you're not asking about athletics in the survey. And again, you can see how we're citing our data and who's doing that work. And then, right, like where can you ask? So, we added custom questions. Have you talked about the survey posters or programming with coaches or teammates? And this gives us some iterative feedback in thinking about who's engaging with it. I love that, almost 2/3 of the student athletes reported discussing survey information with their teammates at least one time. For the meals, I like using existing structures, right? We don't have the time, bandwidth, or support to come up with a new series. So anytime I can get into a faculty workshop, a lunch and learn, training for our faculty who teach our first year courses, class visits, training advisors, our Center for Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship, new faculty orientation. I'm trying to get into those already RA training. I'm trying to get into those existing spaces. What structures? It sounds like, Matt, you have some structures of groups that already meet, like Board of Trustees. There's presentations at Board of Trustees. For either one of you, what other existing structures are appealing places for you to try to get that data meal in?
One that seemed to be the best was when we did it with Dean's Cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Provost Cabinet, sorry, Provost Cabinet. And they loved it because they're all faculty. They're used to teaching their students every day about data and what does the data say. So it was really funny to present this to our student affairs folks. And student affairs is a little more sociable. It is a little bit more of the friendliness, the fun. the belonging, and when I would talk about substances, they'd be like, "Oh, that no," or "Oh yeah, I remember when I was in college," and the faculty were more like, "That's the data. That's what it says." And they would like in real time start talking about, "We need to figure out why this is what it is,
Yeah.
so that we can do something about that." So it was like night and day between those two groups.
Uh-huh. Sean, are there places on your campus that feel like natural existing structures?
Outside of these, I mean, the group that we go to often to get feedback is Student Government Association.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, they're insightful, and I think they want to sometimes show off what they know a little bit too.
Uh-huh.
So that yeah, they'll engage with us on a range of th topics and why
Yeah.
they think things are the way they are.
Yeah, and that's great, right? Because sometimes I can't ask for something and get any traction, but if our student government does, the college might, sometimes listens in a different way. Yeah, so I like that. And I like, right, like they like to know things. Whenever I'm presenting this kind of stuff to like our RAs or our orientation leaders, I always frame it as, of course, you all know this, but these are things that first years might need to know when I know full well that our second years and our third years who are RAs and orientation leaders also don't know this, but they're more likely to engage when I'm engaging them as a helper and someone who knows Mac, right? So I have a couple of minutes for questions. I love that we got to talk about some things as we went, but any lingering questions or any here's a thought of something you do that's successful that we can learn from you about?
One thing that I've used our data for recently, and it actually really gets kind of comedically combative. I will use those
Hmm.
terms. We've got a sanctions course, and I have woven in there because it's based on choices.
Hmm.
Woven in there are data.
Hmm.
And I've got the alcohol choices, and then I
Hmm.
did a build a spin-off for cannabis.
Hmm.
And the cannabis one, oh my goodness, the amount sometimes that students are like, it's healthy, it's fine. You're not talking about the healthy aspects of cannabis.
Yes.
I had one just this morning as I was reading their responses. I
Uh-huh.
was like, she told me that and keep in mind, I got all of this from the ACHA. I needed to look at my surveying, how I'm asking the questions better.
Hmm.
Um, and I need to promote the positive aspects, not just the negatives, because um, that leads students to think that I'm out to get them. And everyone in my survey lied. And it's much more pervasive than what my survey leads.
Wow. And I think about it. I'm not at American College Health Association this week, but Jason Kilmer is and doing a keynote on cannabis. And I'm thinking if he were here, the first thing he would say was, isn't it interesting that our students who use cannabis are actually the ones who are most likely to have the most misperceived norms
Hmm.
of how common cannabis use is on our campuses, right?
Yeah, and I did because we do this. We've had some really good success with it. It's actually in D2L. It's asynchronous.
Mm-hmm.
And I put in the comments, I was like, I don't know if you read these comments, but I want you to know it came from this national
Yeah.
survey.
Uh-huh.
In fall 25, there were this many schools that participated,
Mm-hmm.
and there were this many students that participated. And I
Mm-hmm.
just need you to know that you can find the report in there
Yeah.
and understand that apparently, based on what you're telling me, all of these people are lying nationwide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
The hell
and
of a coordinated effort.
yeah, it's a coordinated effort, all 50 states, every single campus. College students are collectively lying to us.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always, when I do this synchronously in a basics conversation or a motivational interviewing for cannabis conversation, I often say like if students were over assuming how many other students were using X substance, like what kinds of things would be happening that might make them over assume? And it's really interesting when they start generating the reasons why people might have misperceived norms.
Mhm.
I want to be respectful. We're running up right at 11 o'clock. Thank you both for being here and being so engaged. And thanks to folks who will be watching this recording later at a time that suits them better. I hope this is helpful for other folks. And finish out May and whatever's left of your academic year, fiscal year. So thanks, Annabelle.
Thank you so much.